The high-quality opening sequence with its detailed graphics cues you in that this dates to the latter days of the Famicom. Not sure what this has to do with the tower in the sky, but the obscure details are deliberate. Instead of shoddy 8-bit writing, this is building suspense for a plotline. Today I'm blabbing about God Slayer, Sonata of the Distant Heavens, SNK's second ever original home console release. It came out in the United States as the NES cult classic Crystalis. You see, God Slayer was far too interesting of a title, and in those days interesting things were illegal in the United States, especially in video games. Or, Nintendo of America didn't want the word God in a title to avoid riling Christian conservatives, much less the blasphemous God Slayer. The company is somewhat obscure now, but in their heyday, SNK was a successful arcade developer and even released their own home console, the Neo Geo, and a portable too. Back then, SNK's claim to fame was fast-paced arcade action and spectacle. Lots of bullets, lots of quarters. Usually it made absolutely no sense, but there were explosions and guns, so people could accept that. Today, SNK subsists primarily on endless sequels to the long-running King of Fighters series and re-releases of other old fighting games of theirs. In a move I have to applaud, however, SNK keeps their older titles available, including Godslayer. You can buy it on GOG and Steam right now as part of the enormous SNK 40th Anniversary Collection. See? The hero from Godslayer is in this promotional artwork, way up there near the top. Clearly, Athena and Che Guevara are bigger selling points. This collection includes the Japanese and North American versions, though the emulation seems to skip sound sometimes. Maybe it's an issue with my setup, but my computer is pretty powerful. Either way, I don't think you should buy this collection, though. On the one hand, right, it's great that these titles are available. Buying Famicom games still being sold by their creators is great, assuming that the same people are still working at SNK. On the other hand, Electronic Gaming Development Company has a 96% stake in SNK. EGDC is a subsidiary of the Mohammed bin Salman Foundation. In other words, SNK now largely belongs to Mohammed bin Salman, the vile dictator of the brutally misogynistic and repressive monarchy of Saudi Arabia. You might recall the high-profile case from a few years ago, where bin Salman was the man who ordered the murder and dismemberment of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, as well as him being a key figure in the ongoing US-backed destruction of Yemen. It's 2022, and we're still dealing with evil princes? Okay, well, before I go off on a TOS-violating rant, whatever we make of SNK's dealings, what you can't get in the 40th Anniversary Collection is a retranslation of Godslayer more accurate to the original text. Today we're looking at just such a fan translation. If you're really curious about the differences, I notice little substantial beyond smoothness, grammar, and just more color and detail, as well as the obvious religious references and use of alcohol. The group responsible for the retranslation is Stardust Crusaders, a respected name in the fan translation community. You might recall that they also translated Metal Slayer Glory, so I trust them. Godslayer opens with another short cutscene. Next, a computer program instructs us to input our name. If you leave the name input blank, the game defaults to SNK, which I suppose rather hilariously is the hero's canon name. In the Japanese text, they're also called SNK, but spelled phonetically in hiragana instead of Latin letters. The Game Boy Color remake defaults to Samiya, which at least sounds like a name. More on the Game Boy Color version later. The purple-haired hero awakens from cryogenic sleep, though the box art suggests they're brunette. That would be within the Famicom's color capabilities, but in largely brown environments, the purple stands out more. I love this shot, the huge green machine in the cave. Yeah, that guy apologizes to us later, but there's really no need. If someone exploded out of a mountainside in front of me, even if they didn't attack, I'd be alarmed too. Talking to the townsfolk in Wind Valley, I stumble upon the town elder. Bergen Trukang. With 4 swords in tow, the warrior will shed their light upon mankind. Here, take this sword. It will serve you well on the path that lies ahead. And the elder hands us the Sword of Wind. Afterwards, I gather that the windmill hasn't been turning in ages, even though this is Wind Valley, and that I should seek out the sage Zebu. Zebu calls me the Chosen One. Try to get the windmill at the other side of the valley moving. If you do, I will lend you my assistance. Only then? Am I or am I not the Chosen One? To do that, I need to wake up the lazy man who's supposed to run the windmill, and to do that, I need to buy an alarm flute from the shop in Wind Valley. This makes me wonder how the natives normally use alarm flutes. You can't set the flute to sound at a specific time, so I imagine it's intended for pranksters. The windmill turning somehow breaks open a cave that leads out of the valley. Then the wise Zebu teaches us Refresh, Godslayer's healing magic, and that's all. No other guidance or instruction. What is this prophecy? Since this is an old video game, this savior must be us, but why were we frozen in a mountain? What was that flying tower? Is the prophecy a misremembered plan from the old world, like Project Gestalt? Well, yes. One thing that sets Godslayer apart is the way the story is presented. Usually a Famicom RPG opens with an exposition dump, and Godslayer is no exception. However, this exposition dump has no obvious connection to the player's activities until much later on. I appreciate this setup. Instead of thinking, okay, let's go beat the Lord of Evil, I'm motivated onward by curiosity. While Godslayer is just a pulpy fantasy adventure children's video game, this type of storytelling is also part of what makes Cave Story memorable. At the beginning, it seems like nothing is going on, but something is. Godslayer is a top-down action RPG. Given that SNK's past experience was all balls-to-the-wall action, with the occasional erotic breakout mahjong game, this seems like a logical choice as opposed to a turn-based RPG. You've seen this all before, in my Famicom Adventure series even. There are many towns with shops, inns, and characters who will blab a few lines of dialogue. Between the towns are an overworld and dungeons, both full of respawning enemies, mostly mutant plants and animals. Later on, you fight other humans who are a lot tougher. While enemies spawn infinitely, these aren't random encounters since the same enemies will spawn in the same areas, and you can just run past them without penalty, aside from, if you're careless, losing some HP. Killing enemies gives money and EXP. It's hilarious that centuries after the fall of modern civilization, the currency is dollars. Guess this is kinda like Marvel Land. Dollars are just the universal currency in every world. Gain enough EXP and the hero levels up naturally. Surprisingly, Godslayer has a level cap at 16, which you can easily reach by playing normally. And you have to in order to beat the last boss. Given the amount of combat you'll experience just exploring, Godslayer never becomes too grindy. But this is coming from someone who played through Esper Dream and Valkyrie no Boken, so these traumatic experiences might have warped my perspective. Money can be used to buy armor, healing herbs, and other items. Typical RPG stuff. Weapons aren't available at shops though, at least not for us. In Godslayer, the hero attains 4 swords, each with a different elemental affinity. The Sword of Wind, Sword of Fire, Sword of Water, and Sword of Bolt. Bolt as in lightning bolt. Instead of swinging their sword like a Link to the Past Link, SNK upon a tap of the B button only stabs, like The Legend of Zelda Link. That means standing pretty near enemies and having a narrow range of attack. Given our generous hitbox, this isn't preferable. The animation also looks silly. Combat like this makes me feel like a clown. Instead, you want to hold down the B button briefly to build up the force meter beneath your life bar. This allows you to blast something like the sword beam from The Legend of Zelda, striking enemies from a greater distance. Initially, you can get away with flailing at a slime, but later on, against enemies like these mace-swinging lizard men, melee attacks are out of the question. Each sword has 3 levels of force charge. The second level of charge is only unlocked after the hero attains the orb corresponding to the sword's element. Ditto for the third level, except it's a bracelet instead of an orb. In other words, for the Sword of Wind, you have to find the Wind Orb, for the Fire Sword, the Fire Orb, and so on. The first level of Force Charge allows for the standard ranged attack, the second allows for a stronger attack that can break through certain walls, and the third for a massive attack, even a screen-clearing attack depending on the sword. While the latter two are tempting, unfortunately they drain MP. You want to save MP for healing magic and later teleportation to escape long dungeons, so in practice I rarely use the stronger attacks except against bosses. Each level of charge summons another set of orbs to orbit the hero, so that's why you keep seeing those things spinning around them. Given the implied nuclear war, I wonder whether this is supposed to suggest atomic power. Or maybe they're psycho orbs like in SNK's Psycho Soldier. Although we have MP, our powers do seem to not be magic so much as psychokinesis. Enemies have different elemental weaknesses. This is common in RPGs, but the issue here is that tons of enemies are completely invulnerable to certain swords. There seems to be no way to discover elemental weaknesses except through trial and error. Initially, I thought enemies might be color-coded so that maybe every blue enemy was weak to fire, for example, and the blue walls could be broken with fire magic too, but no. If there is a pattern, I missed it. This results in frustrating situations where you're trying to get through a cave, but to fight different enemies that are all charging at you at once, you have to keep opening the menu to switch between different swords. Doing this once or twice isn't a big deal, but flow-disrupting menu navigation becomes a constant as our arsenal increases. If Godslayer has a major flaw, this is it. As for the magic system, like in Valkyrie no Boken, the hero can equip magic spells, in this case learn from the four sages Zebu, Tornal, Athene, and Kenso. Pressing the A button will cast the spell, using up some MP. Spells include Refresh, the basic healing spell, Recover, which cures several status ailments, and Change, which allows you to transform into various other people so as to deceive others and get unique dialogue from NPCs. The issue is that items are also used with the A button. Since you can equip a spell and an item simultaneously, and Godslayer always gives the magic spell priority, this can result in unintuitive situations. For example, to climb the sheer ice on Mount Sable, SNK needs to equip the rabbit boots and hop like a rabbit. But for a while, I thought I misunderstood the use of the rabbit boots because the hero refused. Turns out I had to unequip the magic spell so that the A button would use the item instead of the magic spell. Using the B button both to attack and to hand off certain items is also goofy, since it makes it look like we're about to stab the person we're talking to. If Godslayer has several major flaws, these are them. No weapon upgrade is optional. To reach the ending, the player also must have every sword and every orb, which will merge together into the ultimate weapon and USB security key, the Godslayer. As you might guess, in Crystalis, the sword's instead called the Crystalis. After Wind Valley, Godslayer opens up. The hero emerges onto the vast Cornell Plains, a grassy mountain-bordered region full of tougher enemies with links to multiple towns and dungeons. Frankly, this is about as much of a valley as Wind Valley. Godslayer is not particularly non-linear or open-ended, though. Like a standard Metroidvania, while the path is rarely A to B, Godslayer still guides the player toward a specific series of bosses and areas that must be completed in a certain order. A to B to C to B to E to D to A again. Also like a Metroidvania then, Godslayer creates a feeling of openness, making the world seem more alive, as opposed to the series of challenges it is. I suppose the Moblin-style pig mutants and giant walking mushrooms also make it feel alive in a different way. So while it is possible to walk into the Forest of the Lost, the poison in the air will instantly send you running the other direction. And if you try taking the northern path up to Mount Sable, Zebu telepathically contacts us to say we're not strong enough. So one way or another, you will walk into Traveler, the town nearest the cave exit. Traveler exists as a waypoint for, get this, travelers, though I'm shocked to learn there's much travel with so many monsters around. Come to think of it, every town should probably be surrounded by armed guards to keep mutants from charging in and slaughtering everyone. To be fair, this massive, embarrassing failure to account for the setting also plagues the whole Final Fantasy series, so maybe I can forgive it here. In Crystalis, Traveler is called Brynmire. Here we meet Akahana, a shifty treasure hunter with what I thought were big purple lips. In reality, those 4 pixels probably represent a red nose, since Akahana literally means red nose. Since he says he lost a rare bronze statue near the river, though in a world without mass production I'd have thought any work of art is definitionally rare, we search around the grass by the river until we stumble upon it. I wasn't sure what the statue is supposed to depict, but much later on in Joel, the sprite is reused as the sea goddess statue, the patron deity of fishermen, so I think it's supposed to be a long-haired woman with her head at an angle, running her hands through her hair, or maybe with her back turned and her hands up mid-stretch. In exchange, Akahana gives us a gas mask to filter out the poison in the Forest of the Lost to the east, and then runs off to resume his own shady dealings. Since we can, might as well investigate the Forest of the Lost. This place looks so cool with the writhing plants, killer truffula puffs, and deadly haze. In Traveler, somebody also mentioned there's a place here called Orc Village, but the orcs speak another language, so there's no use talking to them. In Crystalis, the orcs are called oaks instead. They don't look or behave anything like those kinds of orcs, and they're also definitely not oaks. So either way, I suppose they bear the name of something they're not clearly connected with. But sure enough, we can't talk to the orcs. For some reason, in Crystalis, instead of saying what I suppose is orcish language, the orcs all say, "Go in peace," completely screwing up the idea that they're supposed to be speaking a foreign language. The orcs are the only non-hostile monsters, though they still hate humans. All the other new beasts that emerged after the end of days are out for blood. But Zebu isn't the only sage who can teach us magic. A second one, Tornell, lives at the end of a bridge in the north of Cornell Plains. If you happen to talk to him and defeat his apprentice Stom, which always takes 3 tries, he teaches you telepathy. I wonder how one teaches telepathy, especially in a matter of seconds. It's kind of you're either a telepath or you aren't, I would think. With telepathy, we can now directly communicate with the orcs. Why not? Turns out the orcs hate humans and don't want us in their town. But one orc's child has gone missing in the Forest of the Lost, oh no! Luckily, the kid is unharmed. That's right, not a silent protagonist. Thank you so much! You've saved my little boy. Here, take this flute. The orcs realize we might not be so bad, though I doubt they'd trust any other humans. So the lesson here is probably that doing the right thing won't end bigotry, but it might still help you. And again, the insect flute apparently calls forth monsters, so the mother might have been trying to kill us. Or she recognized that we're a mighty warrior. Do you believe in God? The Orc Elder now trusts us enough to ask us to slay the monster that haunts the poisonous marsh, so the insect flute will come in handy. It doesn't attack this village because we have God's blessed vessel, but we are all too weak to wield the vessel, so I'll give it to you instead. I know this is a shameless thing to ask of you, but I'm begging you to save us. Paralleling the last village elder, this one gives us the Sword of Fire, the second of the elemental swords. We also learn the swords are believed to have been blessed by God. Also, when holding up the sword, SNK's armor disappears, exposing their black tank top. Sexy. So now there's a little plot twist. The orcs are isolated because a monster has trapped them in this remote place. Sword in hand, like the boy who slew the Jabberwock, we head out to this suspiciously large and empty part of the Forest of the Lost. And then... as you might notice, the insect the sound of this flute is summoned is not an insect at all, but a bootleg Omu. You don't want to kill an Omu, but this monster goes down about as easily as the first boss. And it leaves behind the fire orb. Afterwards, Tornell decides we're strong enough to take the northern path to Mount Sable. I relate all this to give an idea of the progression in Godslayer. Often, you're not quite sure whether what you're doing has anything to do with anything, but interesting events happen, and since the player can do nothing else, the adventure provides new equipment, new areas to explore, and advances the plot. In comparison to an older action RPG like Valkyrie no Boken, there is much more narrative and direction surrounding what can feel like directionless exploration. Another case of subtle exposition is casting telepathy, which reveals, I think for the first time, that there are 4 sages. Since the sages seem to know something about what's going on, I guess we could seek out the other 2. Shake them down for answers. Might as well. If nothing else, they'll give us more magic spells. The sages dispense not terribly useful hints, but their messages change over the course of the adventure, again lending a sense of verisimilitude to the world. The 3rd sage is Athene, who whimsically leads a double life in the capital city, Portoa, wasting our time, if we let her, I suppose so she can have some company for once. What a coincidence that after the fortune teller advises us to visit the Queen expects us. She teaches Barrier, the shield spell. We find the 4th sage, Kenso, collapse drunk in a shack. Definitely a contrast to the previous 3. This troublemaker casts change to alter his appearance to try and get the hell away from us. He only agrees to help the rebellion against the Dragonian Empire after we harass him enough times, chasing him from town to town. When he's hiding out as a girl at an aerobics studio in Swan Village, Kenso flirts with us, so I'll say he's bi. Imagine if you could just change from a man to a woman, like with a snap of your fingers. You could have a lot of fun. But wait, Athene? Kenso? As in Psycho Soldier Athena? I guess we are psychics. The original Crystalis translation totally missed the reference, and instead calls these 2 Asina and Kinsu. By the way, if you're curious, Stardust Crusaders is accurate to the Japanese by transliterating the sage's name as Athene instead of Athena. For the unfamiliar, Athena and its sequel Psycho Soldier are some of those goofy arcade games for which SNK was so famous. I posted a review of them on my website, macrolphones.com. You can read that post if you'd like more information. Since Asamiya Athena, a schoolgirl and pop idol and magical girl, a triple threat, developed her psychic powers because she was descended from the original Heavenly Athena, we know they're genetic. So carrying on the Zelda tradition of families naming everyone the same name forever, the Athene and Kenso in Godslayer might be descended from these 2. Though, judging from the world-destroying Mutants Athena battles in Psycho Soldier, maybe this is the end of days Godslayer talks about. The strongest armor and shield in Godslayer are the Psycho Armor and Psycho Shield, so it really might be in the same continuity. The first humans we fight in Godslayer are soldiers of the Dragonian Empire. It becomes clear they're bad guys after the soldiers murder somebody we met at a bar earlier. They're already dead. Singular they? Non-binary confirmed? Well, it's just that this is a generic descriptor used later on for all kinds of dead people. Anyway, this is a horrible tragedy. When you go to confront the Dragonians, their first move is to try and kill you too. We learn either from the dying man contacting Zebu or visiting the town again that the Dragonians raided Wind Valley, enslaving everyone there in their mine on Mount Sable. Though, bizarrely, the Dragonians seem to keep their enslaved prisoners behind solid walls of stone, instead of, prison bars or something. So already the player knows the bad guys are an expansionist military power, enslaving peaceful neighbor peoples to harvest the raw material they need to fuel the war machine and continue expanding. Oh, incidentally, in Crystalis, this guy seems bizarrely ungrateful for having been liberated from slavery. So you saved us, big deal. In Stardust Crusaders Godslayer, the guy instead says, "Phew, I'm saved." That makes more sense. Kelbesk, the first of the Imperial Tetrarchs, proves the first boss to pose a real challenge and demand multiple healing spells. After defeating, though not killing him, we free the Elder of Wind Valley and spend the remainder of Godslayer as the arch-enemy of the Dragonian Empire. Instead of an exposition dump going on about how the Dragonian Empire is the evil Legion of Doom and evil blah blah blah, the player actually sees the Dragonian Empire doing evil before we have any other context for them. This is what's called show, don't tell. In addition, this is a believable evil, instead of the more typical laughable devil Dark Lord scheming in his castle about how to exterminate the human species for no reason. Definitely makes the Dragonian Empire seem more worth fighting. There isn't much more context in the Devil Dark Lord scheming in his castle, but again, it's good storytelling for a Famicom title, superior to a supposed masterpiece like Dragon Quest III. From here, the plot involves more adventures like freeing Akahana from a Gorgon's curse, an endless onslaught of repetitive battles, finding the other two elemental swords in the depths of perilous labyrinthine dungeons, and discovering a second purple chosen one awoken from cryogenic sleep. Her name is Messia, probably meant to be Messiah. The box art features her and her diadem prominently. Messia first talks to us as a holographic recording inside a cave in Cordell Plains. We don't have much time left to accomplish our mission. I'll go ahead to Dragonia. Hurry and catch up with me. We continue trying to catch up with Messia until another of the Dragonian Tetrarchs, Sebera, kidnaps her. I was a little excited to have an 8-bit female lead with agency, but come on, this is a Famicom title. You have to kidnap a girl sooner or later. That's the law. Actually, Messia takes an active role before she's captured, while she's captured if you fall for Sebera's illusion, and after we rescue her, so at least this isn't Princess Peach, or Princess Peach outside of Super Mario Bros. 2 USA and Super Mario Bros. 3. Actually, maybe the Famicom Mario was more progressive. Messia isn't even necessarily kidnapped, preserving a bit of agency even in her imprisonment. Though unfortunately this interesting stuff all happens off-screen in a case of what's called tell, don't show. Sebera demanded a human sacrifice from Joel Island, which is near the Imperial border. When Messia arrived, out of compassion, and probably a scheme to get closer to a member of the Tetrarchy, she volunteered to go in place of the mayor's daughter. The bumbling Mayor Ralph seems pretty ungrateful. This girl who'd come here from Portoa went on our behalf. I bet she's Monster Chow now, though. Sebera might be the most sinister of the Dragonian Tetrarchs, since she does fit the whole Devil Dark Lord model, conquering an island and using her magic to overrun it with monsters, turn the inhabitants into zombies, and let the only town fall to ruin. None of that seems like it would be terribly helpful to the Empire's strategic goals. Demanding human sacrifices might be, however. It strikes terror into the hearts of their foes and subjects. Like slavery, this is also something real-world empires have done. Almost like murdering and controlling your neighbors to steal their stuff is inherently evil, I don't know. If Sebera were leading intelligent monsters like the orcs, this would make more sense, but the script is never clear as to whether the Dragonian Empire's mutants have human intelligence. You know, the idea of riding a sea mammal around like this might be a reference to Marco the Whale from Valkyrie no Boken. Comparing the two, the advance in graphical technology, or rather improvement in making graphics for the Famicom, is obvious. Eventually, the plot comes together with the Dragonian Emperor seeking to conquer the tower in the sky, which turns out to be a super weapon that might carry the wrath of God. Interestingly, the people in the streets of the imperial capital Goa just blab about this as common knowledge. They also adore and praise the Empire. I was impressed with the comparative nuance of the civilians in the Imperial Corps not being personally monstrous yet still endorsing the evils from which they benefit. But later it turns out that the Emperor is using psychic power to control their thoughts, and when they're brought back to their senses, everyone hates the Empire. Meanwhile, the four sages and most of the other friends we've made operate a rebellion against the Empire out of a hidden town called Shylon. Instead of a Princess Leia type like in Final Fantasy II, their leader is Azteca, a large individual whom the sages apparently already answer to, though he's news to us. But the third of the Tetrarchs, Mado, attacks Shylon and kills most of our friends. Goodbye, Akahana. I knew you well. The Dragonians abduct the sages, whom the Emperor wants to join forces with Messia to summon the tower. It's quite the dark escalation of stakes. That Mado's specialty is turning into a giant bouncy ball to fight us undermines that darkness a bit. After this, to kill all four Shitenno and save everybody, we have to break into the Dragonian castle and navigate a huge maze-like dungeon full of spiky floors and narrow platforms off of which monsters can easily knock us onto lower floors. Ugh, Tower of Hera. You don't necessarily have to do this in one go, but finding a path back out of and back into this enormous maze is difficult. It also becomes hilarious to imagine how the Dragonian bureaucrats could possibly use this space in their daily lives. Yeah, I'm walking to my office by riding the levitating platforms over the dark hallway abysses and floors covered in spikes. Mondays, am I right? Though memories of how many people the Imperial scum have killed keeps us pushing onward. They've even killed me, given all the game overs. Along the way, we find some valuable items. I was already so well equipped these were useless to me, but I appreciate the thought. We also rescue the sages, who heal us to help us with a slog. The final Tetrarch, some kind of blue-robed priest named Carmine, has transformed Tenso into a slime. Turns out Carmine is the one using psychic power to control the populace of Goa. Annoyingly, Carmine can turn you into a slime, at which point there is literally nothing you can do but die. Unless you have a certain item. Just don't get curse. Don't do it.
If you're poor, stop being poor.
But Carmine is just another boss, and the psychic control over the Empire's people perishes with him. At this point, though many good people have died, the Empire has lost. The Emperor himself still has Messia and Azteca though, and is determined to use them to seize control of the tower. So we have to pursue the Emperor to what might be the Great Pyramid of Giza. Beyond the desert of quicksand south of Goa, we find an isolated village. This is the desert village of Sahara. So apparently Godslayer concludes near Cairo. The desert sands are so wet and sucky, but this might reflect climate change somehow. We had to cross an ocean to get to this point. Maybe Wind Valley is in Asia Minor? There was once a tower with a terrifying sort of power. It could destroy the entire world, purging the land of everyone who had lost to the evil in their hearts. There is one who can stop the tower, the one named Saba. Your name has been passed down in legends. You are the light of hope. The legends also spoke of Messia, the one who will guide you. This tale is proceeding just as it was foretold. The last part doesn't make much sense. The Dragonian Empire was in the legend, but now we know that we're prophesied to take down the tower. You fight the Emperor twice in different parts of the mostly buried pyramid, first to save Azteca, and then to save Messia. The first time is pretty easy. The Sauron wannabe flies around and shoots lightning. The trick is, you need to have the power ring equipped. If you don't, it doesn't matter how much you damage the Emperor, nothing will happen. So far as I'm aware, there's no hint or anything else that tells you this. So it seems Godslayer still hasn't totally escaped the Valkyrino Boken or Tower of Draga school of completely hiding essential details. The Emperor explodes, but apparently he's fine. In the next part of the pyramid is yet another cruel way to pad out what is already a respectably long RPG. In order to reach the Emperor, for some reason the player needs to take out the two Guardians before death by projectile spam. But the only way to do this is using the Bow of the Moon and the Bow of the Sun. Again, so far as I know, there is no hint that you need these items or where to find them. If you wander in here without them though, you're dead. You can't just leave. Searching the world for these bows would take hours. Either that or I missed the hint. Maybe it's in the instruction booklet? Anyway, once you get them from the Queen of the Amazons and from the summit of Mount Hydra, you can fight the Emperor once and for all. Those faces on the torches are creepy. A shot from the Bow of Truth that Azteca gave us pierces the Emperor's armor and reveals his true form. Emperor Dragon is literally a dragon. What a twist. Such nonsense is typical for SNK arcade games, but sticks out in the relatively coherent Godslayer. As for how the Emperor grew like 3 times as big, or why we're now in a yellow void, your guess is as good as mine. Maybe the programmers couldn't figure out how to maintain the background detail with such a huge sprite moving around firing projectiles. The Emperor can only be hurt when his chest opens up, exposing his heart for some reason. Don't do this if you want to live. After a few blasts from the Sword of Bolt finish off the Emperor, we get to Godslayer's famous series of ending twists. And these really are twists too. So all his sages teleport in immediately, because when he lies dying, the giant dragon somehow transforms into Azteca? Well done, truly. Everything should be okay now. I was charged with making sure that evil would not appear in this land again. I never would have expected that evil would end up taking root in my own heart. It ate away at me over time, robbing me of my mind and body, and it gave rise to Dragonia's evil deeds. The big bad and the big good were the same person all along. I think? Are Azteca and the Emperor two personalities in the same body? That can't be. The Emperor is literally a giant dragon. But then, why would the Emperor's injuries transfer to Azteca? In the tower, a recorded message calls Azteca a biohumanoid, so he's an immortal human-like android, like in Nier, whom the ancient scientists charged with preventing the rise of destructive militarism of the kind that destroyed the world to begin with. Sorry, but this twist doesn't make much sense. In Crystalis, meanwhile, this scene comes off differently. There, Azteca seems to be dying because the Emperor wounded him. Instead of saying he himself realizes he's evil, he apparently blames himself for the rise of Dragonia because the Emperor read his mind to learn about the evil militarism of the old world. So much for the original's interesting reveal. I wonder if I'm misreading the scene in the Stardust Crusaders translation? Azteca says the evil in his heart gave rise to Dragonia's evil deeds. That's ambiguous, but the first time we injure the Emperor, we quickly meet Azteca, who's injured too. And when we fatally wound the Emperor, afterward the Emperor is gone and Azteca is lying on the floor of the same room dying. So I think I'm right that Azteca and the Emperor are the same person. Anyway, after this we approach a crystal like something out of Final Fantasy, but instead we switch to sci-fi. The crystal is a teleporter that warps us onto the flying tower, the final dungeon. Not much of a dungeon really, but more an endurance run. You need to clear out 3 floors of robotic guardians. Seeing the weathered computer sustaining this system up close is quite cool, especially compared to the tower's low-tech appearance from a distance, but spamming the same attacks against the same enemies over and over and over, while these horrible drones veer around from behind to disrupt your pattern is frustrating. Near the top of the tower comes the final twist. The tower is a computer-operated superweapon designed to wipe out humanity if another world war is on the brink of occurring, because that would mean Azteca failed and humans are irredeemably evil after all. SNK and Messia are 2 of the scientists who designed this entire project. Because Azteca reintroduced rampant imperialism and militarism to the world, the tower system has begun gearing up its attack and awoke both SNK and Messia so that they could decide whether or not humanity needs to be exterminated. At this point, we have to manually override the system. But the idea that the scientists would have designed a system in such a way that they have to battle through the tower instead of just walking to the control room is ludicrous. That would make the story so silly that I wonder if I missed some plot point. Maybe earlier it would have been simple as walking up to a computer terminal and typing stop, but now it's gone too far into the process. Yeah, Godslayer isn't exactly a masterpiece of game design or gameplay. If I haven't made this clear enough, the vast majority of Godslayer is running around identical tunnels and swapping between weapons that control identically to kill monsters in the same fashion over and over. But it isn't great at characterization or world building either. Like, what are people eating? We never see a single farm. But still, Godslayer holds a lasting appeal, and on Famicom is cream of the crop. Comparing it to Valkyrie no Boken and Esper Dream, I appreciate how far this top-down action genre evolved just from 1986 to 1990, developers learning from the successes and failures of previous releases. Godslayer is yet another video game whose devs worked under aliases, so I don't know who specifically is responsible, but best I can tell, the same team at SNK seems to have made everything back then, so there's a good chance some of the individuals who made Psycho Soldier also made Godslayer. Kono Kazuto, apparently the director and producer, also wrote the storyline for the original Athena, which is that Athena gets bored of heaven so starts taking out monsters to get dressed again. Athena isn't really an RPG at all, but in the parlance of 1980s Japanese video games, the fantasy setting and collection of weapon and armor upgrades made it RPG-like. So when SNK moved on to releasing a more proper action RPG, Kono-san must have seemed like an obvious choice to helm the project. Godslayer's narrative is slightly more ambitious than Athena's. Kono later co-produced another RPG for SNK, Shinsetsu Samurai Spirits, Bushido Retsuden. Godslayer's composer, Osaka Yoko, worked on a number of other SNK titles too. Otherwise, I don't know what any of the developers did. Like, the scenario advisor is Jay Sato. What's a scenario advisor? Who's Jay Sato? For some reason, SNK's never made any sequels to Godslayer or reused its characters. Admittedly, it would be harder to connect this far future setting to the King of Fighters, and Godslayer is far outside the graphically impressive fighting games in which SNK came to specialize. But somebody loved Crystalis because in 2000, a United States exclusive remake came out on Game Boy Color. I want to emphasize that this is a remake and not a port. The changes are many and substantial. The remake was created by Nintendo Software Technology Corporation, the same group that at around the same time and for the same system had released a reimagining of the American version of the Famicom hit Top Secret, but with a sci-fi setting instead of the Nazi-killing cheese of the original. All the unusually open-ended storytelling of Godslayer, the gradual accumulation of details into a plot, is instead replaced with a horrible, boring exposition dump like I criticized earlier, accompanied with corny, ugly cartoon illustrations completely inappropriate for an anime-influenced JRPG. Instead of learning about the Dragonian Empire firsthand as a surprise that deepens the setting and raises the stakes, we're told how evil they are by a cutscene. The hero is now a warrior magician, micromanaged by these annoying sages who never stop holding your hand and telling you where to go, although your telepathy can no longer get unique messages out of them at different points of the story. Worst of all, this is such a horrible change I almost can't imagine the team responsible understood why people liked the original storyline. The main characters aren't scientists who help develop the tower. Rather, the Dragonians build the tower as a super weapon. The original could have been written a lot better, but cutting the ending twists altogether is worse than remaking the original Star Wars trilogy and cutting the details about Darth Vader being Luke's father. The player character and Messia are just generic fantasy chosen ones, representing the forces of magic and nature against the evil Empire's forces of technology. If the only way you can imagine a sustainable society is literal magic, then I'm inclined to doubt you have much of the hope for human goodness expressed in the original. Which is putting a ridiculous amount of weight on the throwaway story of a piece of children's pop cultural ephemera, I know, but give me this one. The GBC Crystalis also features one-to-one Famicom sprite conversion. This syndrome afflicted quite a few products from inexperienced developers who wanted to have sprites just as big on the tiny Game Boy screen as on the vast Famicom screen. To compensate for the more zoomed-in camera, the GBC Crystalis moves more slowly, so it actually isn't a problem here. The gameplay has also been simplified. Instead of the constant irritating switching between weapons, each new sword carries over the powers of the previous one. I cannot deny that some people would prefer the streamlining and hand-holding of this version to the open-ended confusion of Godslayer. Personally, I don't mind either approach, if only they hadn't ruined the story to do it. Aside from the sages, the dialogue has also been rewritten and made much wackier. I always suspected humans were kind. Prejudice is so wrong and dumb. Fair point, fair point. You saved the child even after we were so rude. Thank you for teaching us that prejudice is wrong and just stupid. The GBC release also has an entirely new soundtrack composed by Lawrence Schwelder. The consensus on the internet seems to be that this new OST is a huge downgrade from the original soundtrack by Osaka Yoko. I disagree. Osaka's music is fine but generic, just Famicom fantasy adventure fare. I'll shut up a minute so we can listen to a bit of the overworld theme. Schwelder's music, though, is packed with personality. Here is his overworld theme. Funky. The music in the Forest of the Lost incorporates the buzzing insects and the gurgles of the swamp into another bop. I think why people don't like the GBC soundtrack is, first, that nerds hate it when anything is changed, and second, that a lot of the tracks don't suit the tone. I think I know what happened here. Back in the day, most video game developers would create original video games, sure, but in settings plainly derived from existing popular culture. Think how many video games ripped off Aliens. Godslayer, as you've been screaming at your screen, furious I haven't noticed, is a sloppy imitator of Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Like Nausicaa, the story is set in a world full of fantastical mutants long after the fall of modern civilization. The bad guys are technologically advanced imperialists who want to harness the technology that brought about the apocalypse, even though doing so will likely destroy the world again. In Nausicaa, the Toromechian Empire is trying to revive a god warrior. In Godslayer, the Dragonian Empire is trying to control the Tower. The Forest of the Lost is a ripoff of the Sea of Decay, a dark wilderness of fungus and giant bugs whose atmosphere of poison spores kills those who enter without breathing protection. And I already mentioned how this boss is obviously an Omu. The first area in Godslayer is even called Wind Valley. Now, while I might find it plenty of objectionable, Nausicaa is a serious and compassionate story. Well, compassionate to a point. But the idea that anyone could watch the movie or read the manga and come away thinking they should start killing Omu is kinda bone-chilling. So the devs at SNK drew from Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Meanwhile, the American crew localizing Crystalis for NES saw the distant post-apocalypse and the mutants in Godslayer, and their thoughts turned to wizards. You know, Wizards, the Ralph Bakshi film about magical fairies, elves, and dwarves at war against fascist mutants who dare resurrect the technology of human civilization.
The only true technology is nature. All the other forms of man-made technology are perversions. The ancient dictators used technology to enslave the masses.
Yeah, I hate technology. I wish they hadn't used any to make this movie. We'd be better off without movies. It's like Lord of the Rings, except instead of destroying the ring, they need to destroy a film reel of Hitler, so they do literally destroy the last movie. Well, if that were the last movie, we'd be better off without it.
There's been a war, and this land is lost.
Why can't we fight and win, Mommy?
Because they have weapons and technology. We just have love.
Psychedelic, man! The storyline of the GBC Crystalis, about a battle between technology and magic, is present in the NES Crystalis instruction booklet, even though it contradicts the story presented in the actual NES video game. For example, the instruction booklet claims the Emperor builds the tower, when, of course, the story is about the Emperor trying to seize control of the tower. I'm baffled. Whoever wrote this doesn't seem to have played the video game, even with the clunky translation available at the time. Maybe the script had only been partially rendered into English, but the writer had a deadline? In comparison, the Famicom instruction booklet mostly reiterates the story presented in the opening cutscenes, contradicting nothing in the actual video game. So whoever's responsible for the NES instruction booklet was just making stuff up. The GBC remake takes all its narrative cues from this NES manual's Wizards influence plotline, explaining the confoundingly simplified story and goofier tone, and even ugly art style more reminiscent of Wizards than the anime-esque Godslayer. Look, I'm not so obsessed with video games that I've missed that Godslayer really isn't substantially more coherent than Wizards. Still, the revelation in Godslayer that the two purple heroes are part of the team that created the tower and Azteca adds an interesting depth to the story, because it implicates the player character for the destruction we see wrought against this world. At some point, though apparently having lost our memory, and in turn whatever ideological agenda made us think doing such things was okay, we and a whole team were comfortable with exterminating the human species if we decided those people of a completely different future culture didn't meet our moral standards. Isn't this the arrogant mindset and binary paradigm of good and evil, us and them, that ruined the world to begin with? SNK and Messia, like religious fanatics, once imagined that good and evil were inalienable traits, and so, imagining also they themselves were pure good, they behaved in an evil manner. It's no wonder their creation Azteca turns out like his creators, carrying on their paternalistic and imperialist assumptions into the New World. In the name of a black and white religious notion of good that allows for no grays, Azteca embodies the very evil he meant to prevent. When Messia fuses the 4 swords into the God Slayer that takes out the tower's central computer in an easy final boss fight, and then deactivates the Doomsday process, it's not only the godlike wrath of the tower that this technology slays. From the opening cutscene on, the power of the tower and the swords are associated with the wrath of God, or are understood as creations of God. Humanity is said to have brought on the end of days through hubris, through sin. But the fire that rained down was not the wrath of God. The awful destructive power of the tower is neither natural nor divine, but a human creation. The imagined wrath of God we feared was invented and imposed on people by other people. Yeah, it'll be okay. Watching the tower, the final symbol of the destructive hubris of our present era, descend back into the earth from which its parts were mined like the imperialists' hard metal weapons, the 2 scientists, now reformed from the sins of their age, stare out over the recovered wilderness. In their messages, the other scientists emphasize their desire that humans will learn from history, and the ending text states, nobody would ever forget about Saba and Messia, or what these 2 young people had done for them. When SNK uses the Godslayer to slay the tower's central computer, they slay also the notion that the fate of the world is in the hands of God and not of humanity. By learning from history then, and understanding we, and not God, shape our destiny, humanity might be able to recover in this new and better future. Also, we have $35,000, which if you're me is an enormous sum of money, so Saba and Messia can live it up big time. Or however much you can live it up in a world without video games, I mean. But for the time being, we live in a world with video games, so if you'd like to keep enjoying more of that kind of thing, you can always like, comment, subscribe, and click the bell so that YouTube will apparently notify you when I upload new videos. And follow me on Twitter at MacroPhones. I don't know, I hate these call to action bits. I don't even know if they make a difference, honestly. Next time on Famicom Adventures, cars in mazes.